But then we quickly turned to the real reason we could do today, and that's Dr. Connor Crouch. I reached out to him basically out of the blue. He was very generous and said, "Sure, I'll take time out of my day and do a presentation." And I was really glad. I have to admit that sometimes I choose or I like get these topics going for webinars just because I'm interested. Um, so this was definitely one that I saw this paper, these series of papers come out, and I was like, "Oh, I want to learn more about this." And I know if we have a webinar, then it'll be a good opportunity to connect directly. So Connor has a little bit unusual. He early on started out in journalism, but luckily we sort of pulled into natural resources with a master's from University of Missouri, and then a PhD from Northern Arizona University in forest science. He's now a forester with USDA Forest Service, Northern Research Station. And although I feel like we'll get him back in the Southwest. He's currently on detail in the Hiawatha National Forest. Is that right? Did I get that right, Connor?
The Mark Twain in Missouri.
Mark Twain.
Yeah.
Close. Okay, well, without further ado, Connor, I'll turn it over to you. I'll remind everyone that we've got the chat for questions and comments. We'll hold most questions and comments unless it's really urgent until a Q&A at the end, but feel free to put them in at any time. And we are recording so that if you miss something or if you have a colleague who will benefit from this, you can share it afterwards. And if I've forgotten anything else, Rachel, yes, is already putting stuff in the chat. So teamwork makes the dream work. And with that, Connor, I'll turn it over to you.
Cool. Sounds good. Thanks so much for the intro, Xander, and thanks again for inviting me to present on some of the work I've been helping with Aspen in the Southwest. Uh, just want to make sure my screen is showing up all right.
Yes, looks good.
Awesome. So yeah, as Xander mentioned, I am currently a forester with the Northern Research Station located in Columbia, Missouri. But today I'll be presenting on work I did as part of my PhD at Northern Arizona University, and just want to acknowledge the folks who have been really critical in this work. It's been a big collaborative effort. First and foremost, Kristen Waring was my advisor, and she's really been the PI on all these projects and is continuing to move this Aspen research forward. Nick Wilhelmy and Amanda Grady, both with Forest Health Protection and Flagstaff, have been really critical partners of bridging the gap between science and management. Rich Hofstetter and Margaret Moore, both also in the School of Forestry at NAU, and then Paul Rogers with Utah State University and the Western Aspen Alliance. In addition to my co-authors, there's also a long list of people who've contributed to this work. I know some of these folks are on the call today, so really excited to see some familiar names. Lots of National Forest System partners who have helped us identify research sites, get research permission, and really have asked a lot of the questions that have motivated this research. So really excited to have results to share. I also want to thank folks who have helped with fieldwork and just providing other technical support in addition to the organizations that have funded this research. It's really been a big team effort, and it's been a lot of fun to be a part of. I also want to acknowledge that Northern Arizona University sits at the base of the San Francisco Peaks on homelands that are sacred to Native Americans throughout the region. We have research sites on the peaks as well as throughout the state. So just want to acknowledge that our research takes place on these homelands and others sacred to Native Americans. To give you an overview of what I'll be presenting today, I'm going to start just by talking generally about the importance of aspen in the Southwest and really in the West in general. Talk about some current and future threats facing aspen. Then I'll get into talking about a systematic lit review that we conducted focused on Southwestern aspen. Talk about a study where we looked at sustainability and drivers of regeneration and recruitment across Arizona. Talk a little bit about oystershell scale, which is this emerging issue facing aspen, and what factors are influencing this invasive pest. And then lastly, wrap things up for discussing what all of this means for management Really trying to go light on methods and things today and just focus on high level results with the goal that hopefully this is as interesting as possible. I know we all have plenty of webinars and online things to attend these days, so really appreciate you all being here and excited to share this awesome work that we've been doing. Aspen is the most widely distributed tree species in North America. It's a pretty incredible range when you look at it across the continent. But where our research took place in the Southwest, aspen tends to be a really small portion of the landscape, occupying less than 2% of forested land. And Aspen in Arizona in the Southwest really represents kind of the hot, dry southwestern edge of Aspen's range, where we would expect the species to be feeling the effects of climate change earliest and hardest, just because these populations are so far south. Aspen has really important value as a foundation species. It provides critical habitat for an array of plants, animals, and vertebrates. Aspen ecosystems are associated with increased biodiversity, especially compared to neighboring conifer-dominated stands. They provide economic value to local industries from hunting, tourism, and recreation. And also, I think something all of us who have spent time in Aspen ecosystems can appreciate is just the aesthetic and cultural value that these systems provide. As Aspen really is one of the iconic species of the American West. And I would argue that all of these values that we get from Aspen ecosystems are even more pronounced in areas like the Southwest, where we have so little aspen to begin with. And all these values really make managing and conserving this species an important management goal. However, aspen, as many of you know, has been facing issues in recent decades. And when I'm talking about aspen decline here and throughout the presentation, I'm really referring to it as the general loss of aspen at sort of a landscape scale. And there's sort of three pathways that we've identified that have been driving aspen decline. The first is succession to conifers. So aspen in general is a very shade intolerant species, does really well after high severity disturbance. And over time, it tends to succeed to conifers. Further north, there are stable aspen ecosystems that don't rely on disturbance to regenerate and maintain aspen over time. But much of the aspen that we have in the Southwest relies on disturbance. And so you can imagine with a lot of aspen stands regenerating prior to 100 years ago, before fire exclusion practices took place, there are a lot of stands that look like this photo on the left, where you have a mature overstory of aspen that's slowly being replaced by conifers and will eventually be replaced in the absence of disturbance. A more recent and urgent concern are acute mortality events, like the sudden aspen decline events in Colorado and other places that result in pretty rapid mortality of aspen, largely driven by drought in association with insects and diseases and some other factors as well. And underlying all of this are widespread recruitment failures due to chronic ungulate browse. So this is really an issue across Aspen's range. There are lots of different species of ungulates that cause these issues. But really this recruitment failure just intensifies decline. Aspen is a species that tends to regenerate pretty reliably when overstory trees die, because it has that clonal asexual reproduction. But when you have those overstory trees die and they regenerate, oftentimes we're seeing a failure for those regenerating stems to recruit into the overstory because they're just eaten away by ungulates. And so this really intensifies those two other pathways that as aspen tries to regenerate, it fails to do so, and we lose aspen. Looking ahead to the future, there's also real concerns about a lack of suitable climate and habitat available for aspen. This is from a really great paper by Rayfelt and others from 2009 that just models suitable climate for aspen throughout the West and shows that by the end of the century, we're going to see serious declines in the amount of landscape that's suitable for aspen. More recently, outbreaks of an invasive insect, oystershell scale, have really intensified the threat that aspen faces in the West. This is an insect that's been present for over 300 years in North America. It infests an incredibly wide range of hosts. There's hundreds of deciduous trees and shrubs that this species is able to infest. It's particularly common in urban and ornamental settings, and generally has not been a concern in sort of natural forested or wildland settings. That changed though recently, as recent as 2017, 2016, 2017. Managers outside of Flagstaff observed outbreaks of this insect at wildland aspen stands. And since then, these reports have continued to pile up, and we're seeing more and more issues with oyster shell scale. So this is kind of an emerging threat. Here's just a photo of a stand that's been heavily affected by oyster shell scale. This is taken basically in the middle of the growing season, so you can see just how much mortality has been caused by this insect. And these are sort of the stand types that we see being most threatened by oyster shell scale. I'll get into this later, but this is a relatively low elevation exclosure that's really dense with intermediate size recruiting stems. And those are kind of the situations and stands that are most vulnerable to oyster shell scale. One thing I want to point out is that although the first outbreaks of OSS in natural aspen stands were found in the Southwest, this is increasingly a west-wide problem. We've collected reports of oyster shell scale and wildland aspen across 8 states now, and we've also collected observations from 3 additional states on urban aspen. So the more time passes, the more this seems to be a bigger and bigger issue beyond just Arizona and the Southwest. So to summarize the threats that aspen's facing, ongoing succession to conifers from basically 100 years or so of fire suppression and exclusion, chronic ungulate browse preventing successful recruitment of regenerating stems, new outbreaks of oyster shell scale, the overarching threat of climate change, and then also the likelihood that there are going to be unforeseen future threats, sort of like oyster shell scale, that pop up unpredictably. Taking all of these things together, it's hard not to feel a little bit stressed out and having a lot of questions about what can we do to sustain aspen. And so that kind of ties in with this overarching management challenge, which is how do we sustain already stressed aspen ecosystems in an increasingly uncertain future? And pretty much all the work that we've been doing seeks to address this issue. And all the work that I'll be presenting on today kind of ties in with this. So after I've presented a whole bunch of results, and things that we've worked on, I will circle back to this question and try to provide some thoughts on how we can respond to this challenge. First up, I want to talk about a systematic lit review that we published a couple of years ago. And I've got these QR codes throughout the presentation, and those should take you directly to PDFs of the papers. And so this is a review that had kind of 2 overarching objectives. The first was to synthesize the existing literature on how a variety of influencing factors, climate, fire, ungulates, insects, and diseases, influence aspen forest dynamics, specifically looking at the processes of regeneration, recruitment, and overstory survival in the Southwest. We also wanted to synthesize information on management and really discuss how management can promote ecosystem resilience and adaptive capacity. So right now I'm going to focus just on this first objective and talk about some of the results from that. And later on in the presentation, I'll circle back to this second objective and talk about how that informs management. The study area for this lit review is really focused on the southwestern edge of Aspen's range, so encompassing all of these areas here in gray, which includes Arizona, Mexico, Texas, and then the portions of New Mexico that are outside of the Rocky Mountains. Basically, I'll walk through some general high-level results from the systematic review, and here's just a screenshot of one of the tables. Our goal with this was really just to provide sort of a comprehensive resource on aspen in the Southwest. So we essentially compiled all the papers that met our inclusion criteria and just briefly summarize, the geographic scope of the papers, what influencing factors they studied, and whether they were looking at regeneration, recruitment, or overstory survival. So a helpful resource if you're just looking for general information on aspen in the Southwest. In total, we considered around 800 documents for this review. Over 300 of those passed our initial title and abstract screening for a full text review, but only 63 of those actually met our inclusion criteria. 51 of those met the first criterion, which was how those factors that I outlined earlier, insects, climate, fire, ungulates, influence aspen dynamics. And 26 met the second criterion, which was focused on either studies that quantified responses to aspen management or provided clear recommendations for aspen management. The overwhelming majority of the studies that we found were conducted in Arizona. There are only 4 studies from New Mexico, plus an additional 3 papers that provided management guidelines for across the Southwest. And most notably, there were no studies from Texas or Mexico that met our inclusion criteria. And this is a really big knowledge gap, I think, and something that is definitely worthy of further investigation and research. I think these populations, particularly the ones in Mexico that represent the true southern extent of aspen, could have some important lessons to teach us about climate adaptation and how these aspen ecosystems are responding to really warm, dry climates. So definitely a big knowledge gap there that we would like to see filled. To summarize what we found in terms of how these various influencing factors influenced regen, recruitment, and overstory survival, if you know anything about fire, you won't be surprised that fire really significantly increased regeneration and recruitment. And on the other hand, ungulate browse significantly reduced regeneration and recruitment. And what you'll see in these figures here is for the words that are in bold, those essentially indicate particularly strong influencing factors, whereas ones that aren't in bold are a little bit weaker factors. So for example, our lit review indicated that climate had really an uncertain influence on regeneration. There were sort of mixed results there, whereas climate and drought in particular had a negative influence on recruitment. And then unsurprisingly, insects and diseases reduced regeneration and recruitment. Fire had a negative influence on overstory survival. Again, aspen, although it responds really well in terms of regeneration to fire, overstory trees, even really large ones, can be susceptible to low severity fire. Ungulate browse, we found had no influence on survival, although I know there are other studies from portions of aspen's range further north that have found ungulate barking or eating the bark of aspen can contribute to mortality. The big influencing factor for the overstory was drought, reducing survival, and then insects and diseases also having an influence, a negative influence as well. I will say this was published 2 years ago, and I've kind of updated this tentatively based on some newer findings, and those are the ones highlighted in yellow here. So climate, increasingly, there seems to be research indicating that drought does have a negative influence on aspen's regeneration potential and its ability to regenerate. And similarly, insects and diseases, and in particular OSS, oyster shell scale, as you'll see, have a real significant negative influence on recruitment. So looking specifically at work we've done to look at aspen across Arizona, we wanted to answer 2 questions. First, is aspen sustainably regenerating and recruiting? And second, which biotic and abiotic factors significantly influence these processes? And the reason I'm so focused and interested in regeneration and recruitment is that these are really the forests of the future. So we think about these small size classes as being really critical for sustaining aspen into the future. If we don't have aspen in these small size classes, we can't expect to have overstory aspen in the future. Regeneration really refers to the process of new trees establishing, whether that's suckers regenerating from an existing root system or seedlings establishing via sexual reproduction after, say, severe wildfire. And recruitment is more of a process that kind of refers to the transition from regenerating trees into the overstory. So that it's that intermediate size class between regenerating trees and overstory trees. To answer these questions, we established 220 aspen monitoring plots all across Arizona with the goal of establishing a sample that is basically a representative sample of aspen conditions and site types all across the state. And we broke it into 7 major areas just to kind of help classify different regions. And those are shown in the circles here, and you'll see them on some of the next figures as well. So basically, to address that first question of is aspen sustainably regenerating and recruiting, we looked at whether aspen plots, those 220 aspen plots, were self-replacing or not. And basically, we broke it apart by regeneration on the left, recruitment on the right. You can see the orange colors indicating the darker orange is essentially no regeneration or recruitment. The lighter orange indicates There is some regen or recruitment present, but it's not self-replacing, and the purple indicates that a plot was self-replacing. To summarize what we found, about 2/3 of plots lack sustainable regeneration. And you can see generally there's more orange on the regen side than there is purple. And particularly dire is the status of recruitment in the state of Arizona. Over 3/4 of our plots lacked sustainable recruitment. And you can see in the areas around Flagstaff, the South Kaibab, and Mogollon Rim, there were no plots in areas outside of ungulate exclosures or jackstraw treatments that had sustainable recruitment. You can imagine, though, there are situations where you have a plot that either has sustainable regen or sustainable recruitment. It doesn't necessarily need to have both. So when we look at plots that lacked both sustainable regen and recruitment, there were over half of our plots that lacked both of these. So basically over half of the 220 study plots did not have enough small trees in either size class for self-replacement, which is a huge concern. And really surprising to me was that 40% of our plots lacked even a single recruiting stem, which just gives you a sense for how little recruitment there is occurring for aspen in Arizona. In order to understand what's driving these processes, we looked at 3 response variables. And I said I'm not going to go too far into methods, but just to give you an idea generally of what we looked at, we were basically quantifying the density of live regeneration, live recruitment, and dead recruitment. And we looked at a whole bunch of influencing factors. We looked at stand structure, climate in the preceding 5 years, damaging agents, which we assessed at the tree level, management, which includes conifer removal treatments and ungulate management strategies like exclosures or jackstraw treatments, both fire history, severity, whether a plot had burned twice over the past 20 years, site factors, your typical site factors, some data on soils, and then ungulate impacts, direct ungulate impacts as well. So you can see we were really trying to cast the widest possible net to understand what is influencing aspen regen and recruitment across the state. In terms of analyses, we basically used 2 approaches. The first was random forests to assess variable importance from all of those variables that I showed on the previous slide. And then we took those variable importance rankings and used that to inform structural equation modeling. If you aren't familiar with structural equation models, they basically allow you to use theoretical understanding of an ecological system and build a network of linear models that assess how various factors influence each other and a response variable. So you can see the a priori model that we created here, which basically includes all of those different potential influencing factors that I showed on the previous slide. And the models essentially allow you to draw connections on how these things relate to each other. So for example, we know that climate in theory influences fire, influences damage agents, soils, and allows you to draw these connections based on your understanding of a system. And so I'll talk you through a little bit about how to interpret these because they can be complex, but I'm not going to spend too much time talking through these models. Here is the structural equation model that we developed for live regeneration. So again, our response variable here is the density of live regeneration stems in plots across the state of Arizona. And basically what you're looking at, a dotted line between variables indicates an insignificant relationship with an alpha value of 0.05 for significance, and a not dotted line, a straight line, indicates a significant relationship. And then for each of these arrows, there's a number. And you can basically think of this as a sort of a correlation coefficient. So they vary from -1 to 1. The closer they are to 0, the weaker the relationship is. The closer they are to -1 or 1, the stronger the relationship is. And the direction of whether it's positive or negative tells you whether the relationship is positive or negative. So a couple things to point out here. The first is that there are a couple of climate variables, spring climate moisture index and autumn precipitation, that both have a positive influence on live regeneration density, indicating that there are sort of wetter conditions that are more favorable for regeneration density. And then fire strata, this is our sort of our time since fire variable, indicating that there's a whole lot more regeneration in areas that burned in the previous 2 years compared to areas that had been more than 2 years since fire. Not particularly surprising. Next, looking at our structural equation model for live recruitment. A couple of things to point out here. The fire variables showed up as particularly strong, both severity and essentially time since fire. More severe fires were associated with a lot more recruits. And we see that the 2 to 20 years since fire is the time period that's most suitable for Aspen recruitment. A couple other things to point out. Browsing had a really strong, significant negative influence on recruitment, which is not a surprise. And ungulate management tactics, including exclosures and jackstraw treatments, successfully reduced browse and increased recruitment density. And here's just another bar chart showing that essentially we're looking at twice as much recruitment inside of exclosures and jackstraw treatments as we see outside of them. Next, looking at dead recruitment, the model on the right here, I've included live recruitment just so you can compare the two. The one thing that really stands out here is that oyster shell scale shows up as really the only significant direct influence on density of dead recruitment, where we see more oyster shell scale is associated with more dead recruits. And importantly, elevation and ungulate management significantly influence oyster shell scale. So we're seeing a lot less oyster shell scale at higher elevations and a lot more oyster shell scale in areas of ungulate management. And those are things that I will talk about a bit later on, but are important for us to understand how oyster shell scale works and where we're seeing more of it on the landscape. Another important thing to point out is that regeneration doesn't necessarily result in recruitment. And as I showed in those earlier slides with the pie charts, recruitment in general is a lot more hard to obtain for Aspen than regeneration is. This is a figure from a paper that was led by Mike Stoddard at NAU's Ecological Restoration Institute, basically showing Aspen regeneration density on the south side of the San Francisco peaks after the LaRue fire in 2001, before and after. So the fire occurred in 2001. You can see our pre-fire density. After the fire, regeneration increased almost tenfold. So huge increases in regeneration after fire, which is what we would expect. However, by 10 years after fire, we were basically down to pre-fire levels. So there was this huge pulse of regeneration after the fire, but long-term, 10, 20 years after the fire, that never really resulted in a huge pulse of recruitment. And so this really indicates that challenge that we have. I think Aspen in general is relatively easy to regenerate because of its clonal suckering response. It's much harder to recruit, and that's really the key size class to think about future sustainability. A couple other important findings from this study. The first is that there was generally more Aspen regeneration beneath canopy openings. So on the y-axis here, we have the change in Aspen juveniles over the course of a 20-year period. And we're looking at basically initial basal area and change in canopy cover in these two figures. And for both of these, we see decreases in Aspen juvenile density with increasing basal area and canopy cover. And another important finding is generally less Aspen regeneration in hotter, lower elevation sites. So again, change in Aspen juveniles on the y-axis, elevation on the x-axis, seeing increases in Aspen regen with increasing elevation and decreasing regeneration with heat load index, which is basically a proxy for how hot the site is. So this is also supporting some of our findings that the cooler, wetter climates are more favorable for Aspen regeneration. To summarize all of that, warmer, drier sites seem to be less favorable for regeneration, whereas open canopy conditions are more favorable for regeneration. Fire promotes regeneration and recruitment, with higher severity fire being associated with more recruitment. Ungulate browse has a strong negative influence on recruitment, and exclosures successfully reduce browse but are associated with increased oyster shell scale. And oyster shell scale significantly increases mortality of Aspen recruits. So next, touching a bit on the oyster shell scale side of things, just really wanting to emphasize that increasingly, we're learning that it poses a serious threat to sustainability of Aspen by killing these recruiting stems, and also to management success by killing Aspen inside of exclosures. Generally, what we've found regarding oyster shell scale outbreaks is that they tend to be more common on and damaging to intermediate sized recruiting stems, like you see in the photo here. Again, this is being a real concern for sustainability. We already don't have very much recruitment on the landscape, and having an insect that really seems to prefer that size class is concerning. OSS outbreaks, really the most important driving factor that we found seems to be warmer, drier conditions, which is a concern for climate change. OSS is significantly more common inside ungulate exclosures. This is a pattern that keeps showing up when we analyze our data. Could be due to just increased densities of aspen inside exclosures, maybe densities in particular of size classes, those intermediate size classes that are most vulnerable, but could also be due to growth defense trade-offs. So there's been some interesting recent research looking at chemical defenses inside of exclosures, finding that defenses tend to be like chemical defenses are a lot less present in exclosures just because they historically haven't been browsed. And so potentially there's an idea there that with reduced defense chemicals inside of these exclosures, that allows trees to be more susceptible to oyster shell scale. This is something that Kristen Waring at NAU is continuing to investigate, so hopefully more to come on that in the future. And also oyster shell scale outbreaks we found are associated with less recent fire and with higher density of aspen saplings. So a couple important findings that might inform management. And then lastly, when outbreaks are severe, they can spread relatively rapidly and cause high levels of mortality. So in some of the earliest affected stands, we found rates of spread around 10 to 12% per year, which is relatively high, and annual mortality rates of around 10%. So once these outbreaks get going, they can be really impactful to stands. One of the important findings with OSS that we've observed is that there's a really clear elevation threshold. So once we get above about 2,550 meters or 8,350 feet, we don't see oyster shell scale. On the y-axis here, we have basically plot level OSS abundance, 0 indicating no oyster shell scale, 1 indicating all the aspen in the plot were affected by oyster shell scale. So you can see it's really targeting the lower half of aspen's elevation range. But something we've found is that, it's not necessarily elevation per se that's limiting oyster shell scale, it's really climate that's limiting it. And so here are just a handful of thresholds we've identified, climate thresholds, where basically once you get to a certain wet, dry, or wet, cool condition, we don't see oyster shell scale. So for example, maximum winter temperature, once we get to around 5 degrees Celsius, below that, we're not seeing oyster shell scale. A similar threshold for maximum spring temperature. So really across the board, there are these climate thresholds where we're not seeing oyster shell scale. And I think this is a useful tool that we can use to think about modeling like landscape scale risk and identifying areas that are potentially climatically suitable for oyster shell scale now and into the future as climate changes. So to bring us back to the management piece, thinking about, we have all these serious issues. How do we sustain aspen ecosystems? What can managers do? To give you an idea of what current management practices look like, generally practices tend to promote regen and recruitment where aspen already exists. And ultimately the goal is to manage aspen for multiple uses, including wildlife habitat, watershed stability, and aesthetic and recreational purposes. A couple of common management tactics include clear felling declining stands. So as stands start to age out, coming in and clear felling the stand reliably, creating a healthy cohort of regenerating stems. Oftentimes that's done in association with fenced ungulate exclosures. In many areas of northern Arizona where there's really, really heavy ungulate browse, having these exclosures is absolutely critical for ensuring successful recruitment. On the left of the fence is inside of the exclosure. So you can see there's abundant regeneration and recruitment inside of the exclosure here. Outside of the fence, there's essentially no aspen at all because anything that suckers up outside of the fence gets munched down immediately. And I'll mention of particular concern, we have some research indicating that non-native Rocky Mountain elk in Arizona are really the concern. Of course, deer also have an impact on recruitment, but it seems like it's the non-native Rocky Mountain elk that were brought down from Yellowstone in the early 1900s that are really the concern for aspen, at least in Arizona. Of course, this isn't active management per se, but a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of managing for aspen and creating suitable conditions for aspen is done by high severity wildfire. And although nobody wants a bunch of high severity wildfires, I think this is one sort of glimmer of hope for aspen's future persistence in the Southwest. This is a photo from about 10 years after the Wallow fire. You can see basically the overstory of conifers just got completely nuked. And there's essentially just a sea of aspen underneath it. So although there are tons of threats to aspen in the Southwest, a future of more frequent, more severe, larger wildfires is likely to bode well for aspen. The question really is what's the balance of these things? How much benefit does aspen get from wildfire and other high severity disturbance versus the losses that it's going to suffer from climate change, ungulate browse, oyster shell scale? And that's really an open question. So I would argue that the current management strategies of promoting regen or recruitment where aspen already exists is not enough to sustain aspen and to address the variety of threats that it faces. And I'd argue in the lit review paper that I mentioned earlier, we make the argument that we should be thinking about trying to promote aspen population flexibility across the landscape and increasing its resilience and adaptive capacity. And just to define these terms for folks who might not be familiar, resilience refers to an ecosystem's capacity to absorb disturbance and reorganize such that pre-disturbance composition, structure, and function are eventually reattained. Whereas adaptive capacity sort of takes that a step further and is an ecosystem's ability to adjust its composition, structure, function in response to external forces and basically creating sort of a new system. And this can kind of be thought of on a continuum of managing for persistence versus managing for change. And generally, I think a lot of the aspen management that we're currently doing is more on the managing for persistence side. Whereas if we're going to be addressing these serious threats, climate change, insects and diseases, we should be thinking more about managing for change and giving these ecosystems the ability to adapt themselves. The advantage for aspen is that it does respond really well to high severity disturbance. With its really wind dispersed seed, it has the potential to colonize new areas. So trying to facilitate that change and giving aspen opportunities to adjust where it occurs and adapt to climate is going to be important for sustaining this species. We came up with 3 different management objectives for thinking about how to increase resilience and adaptive capacity. And we present those in the lit review paper. The first is to promote diversity in age structure by enhancing regeneration and recruitment. As I've shown, there's a real lack of regeneration and recruitment across Arizona, and this is definitely an issue in other areas of aspen's range as well. And so thinking about enhancing regen recruitment is going to be important for setting up these ecosystems for success and allowing them to adapt to future change. Another big one is mitigating ungulate impacts. I think as much as we focus on things like oyster shell scale and these invasive threats, I would argue that ungulate impacts, at least right now, are the most important threat to aspen in the Southwest, just because it's so difficult to regenerate aspen, recruit aspen. And as long as we have these really large ungulate population densities, that's going to continue to be a challenge. So mitigating ungulate impacts is a major objective to strive towards. And then lastly, a broader goal of just thinking about how we can enhance complexity, whether that's structural, adaptive, or functional complexity in these systems, and trying to think about how we can give these ecosystems as a diverse potential for adaptation and response, because we can't always predict what the next issue is going to be, just like oyster shell scale popped up somewhat unpredictably. In the review paper, we have a figure that shows essentially at landscape scale and stand scale some different management strategies and whether or not they're able to meet these 3 different objectives that we set out. And so I think this is useful for thinking about trade-offs and different management tactics. Something like directly reducing ungulate populations, although challenging and outside of the hands of forest managers, would go a long way in meeting all 3 of these objectives at the landscape scale. Wildfire, depending on size and severity, could also meet these different objectives. And as I talk about in the next slide, also has some important implications for managing oyster shell scale as well. whereas silvicultural techniques generally can promote diversity at the landscape scale, and can do that at stand scales as well. May not necessarily increase stand scale complexity, although they may do that at the landscape scale. And oftentimes silvicultural techniques don't address ungulate impacts. So definitely some advantages and drawbacks for these different treatments and worth thinking about trade-offs. But also what's possible, because realistically, silviculture is going to be much easier for managers to implement than, say, directly reducing ungulate populations, as much of a benefit as that might be. Lastly, just wanted to wrap up with some kind of management implications and takeaways from the research we've been doing in Arizona. The first is that more fire should result in more regeneration recruitment. Regeneration management tactics like planting or clear felling should be targeted on wetter, cooler sites where aspen regeneration is likely to succeed. Importantly, regen does not equal recruitment. And I think we really need to be focusing not just on managing for regeneration and thinking about how to get smaller size classes. We really need to be focused on how we can move those size classes into the overstory. And so really managing for recruitment means addressing the dual threats of chronic ungulate browse and oyster shell scale. Directly reducing ungulate population sizes would be probably the most effective approach for doing this, but that's certainly challenging politically and socially. Managing for aspen at higher elevations where they're less susceptible to oyster shell scale is one option. Indirectly mitigating damage from oyster shell scale. Our research essentially has indicated that eradication of oyster shell scale is likely out of the picture because it's already so widespread. And instead, we should be focusing on suppressing these outbreaks and trying to mitigate damage to aspen ecosystems. A couple of examples of suppression tactics and trying to manage oyster shell scale would include reducing reliance on ungulate exclosures, particularly at low elevations, which seem to be really favorable for oyster shell scale outbreaks. Increased application of fire at the landscape scale. As I mentioned, we see less OSS in areas of recent fire, so this is an opportunity to not just regenerate aspen, but also potentially to knock back oyster shell scale. And then also potentially decreasing aspen stand density. As I mentioned as well, we see less OSS in areas with less, that are slightly less dense. And so potentially reducing stand density, say in exclosures, would be one way to mitigate outbreaks of oyster shell scale. And there are experimental trials ongoing for clear felling, sanitation, thinning, and pesticide application. So that's something that Kristen Waring at NAU is continuing to lead with forest health protection partners like Amanda Grady. So I would definitely encourage you to keep an eye out for information on these different treatments and how effective they are longer term at eradicating OSS, as this is still being evaluated. With that, just want to say thanks again for giving me the time. Thanks to Xander for inviting me. I've included the QR codes for the various papers that I included throughout, so I encourage you to check those out if you're interested in learning more about anything I presented on today. And it looks like I managed to leave some time for questions, so happy to answer those. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that was perfect, Connor. Lots of interesting topics. I'm fascinated by your use of the random forest and the structural equation modeling, but we won't go into that. Instead, there's some maybe more useful questions. The first, just pulling from the chat, Lucy asked, what role, if any, does the genetic variability play in aspen distribution and survival?
That is an excellent question that I would love to have the answer to as well. I think anytime we present on this aspen stuff, that's the first question is, what do we know about genetics? How does that relate to susceptibility to oyster shell scale? I think there's still a ton of work to be done on that front. There are some studies of, genetic diversity across aspen's range, some evidence that there are certain genotypes that are more susceptible to drought and dieback, and sort of those acute decline events. But I think we don't, particularly when it comes to things like oyster shell scale, maybe chemical resistance to ungulate browse, we don't know a lot And I think that's very much still an open question, and there's a lot of room for research in that area.
Yeah, great. I'm going to go to a question from Paul about uh, if there is any data on oyster shell scale within large fires, um, but not protected from ungulate exclosures. So, for example, is OSS prominent within the Wallow wildfire footprint?
That's a good question. I'm not sure we've thought about that interaction or like thinking spatially within large wildfires. It'd be interesting to explore. Um, Generally, our findings are like if an area had burned in the previous 2 years, we essentially had not seen oyster shell scale in plots that had burned in the previous 2 years. Whereas once you get to the 2 to 20 year range, there was more oyster shell scale in some of those areas, but still significantly less than areas that hadn't burned at all. In the Wallow fire specifically, I don't think we saw any OSS out there. A lot of that's at, I think, too high of an elevation for us to be seeing oyster shell scale. Um, and that seems to be the limiting factor is more the elevation climate piece. But yeah, interesting to think about, spatial spread within those larger wildfires, which we would think, I guess, would sort of increase or reduce the likelihood of OSS outbreaks because it's inhibiting their ability to spread over those really large areas.
Yeah, it does feel like there's a complex interaction because if there's often we see high densities like an exclosure situation where you're seeing OSS, but your data is suggesting there's less OSS after fire. So sort of it's not clear which of those factors will win out, and it does feel like a useful thing to keep an eye on.
For sure, yeah. And I don't know that we have enough data to pull apart that interaction, but it would be really interesting to think about. And I still think we don't necessarily even know in those higher density exclosures what in particular is driving more OSS. I think there's hypotheses about what's driving that, and density is a logical one, but I think there are other potential explanations there.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, which might not apply to the wildfire, high densities after wildfire. Okay, so Mary Stuver had a question about plant associations and whether you sort of included those in any of your variable assessment for where regeneration or recruitment was doing better. And she just notes that in her field work, she's seen better regeneration in that blue spruce sedge plant association versus the blue spruce, Arizona fescue, because the sedge is a little bit wet. Well, perhaps because the sedge is a little bit wetter.
Yeah, we did not look at that. That would actually be a really interesting way to look at the data that I've not thought about. I think we somewhat captured that because we included site factors like elevation, and slope, and in particular looking at some of those climate variables that I'm assuming are going to be really correlated with those different plant types. But it would be interesting to see if they're sort of more um, finer scale differences that we could pull apart. And I think, yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about analyzing the data.
Yeah. And then just calling attention, and maybe that we can follow up on this offline, but Joseph noted that more than 10 years ago, he installed a whole bunch, 250 permanent monitoring plots in and outside of exclosures all over the Kaibab. And those could be, sort of useful to you for looking back at some of this.
Yeah, that would
Um,
be awesome.
so, and then, linking in the point that you made that the best and most browse resistant recruitment was in these large wildfire footprints. Um, and then Lucy had another question. Would you anticipate that continued reintroduction of beaver to watersheds eventually increases local aspen survival and recruitment overall because of its connection to water wetness by raising the water table and expanding the footprint of wetter areas.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense to me, and I think especially as we're thinking about climate adaptation and trying to keep some of these more, you know, vulnerable lower elevation stands, trying to identify sites that say are around springs or around perennially wet areas are going to be really important. And so yeah, maybe restoring beavers and creating more increased kind of surface water availability would help towards that.
Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense. And yeah, that sort of bringing in other aspects, right? Like that's sort of a wildlife issue with beaver management. And similarly, Lance brought up this point that um, regulating ungulate numbers, can be done more effectively on private lands. There's some large ranches in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, where maybe this is a public-private kind of connection where sharing some of this information is useful. And it also makes me think that, some folks, Connor, you're not really in a position to, I don't know, talk to game commissions, but many of us are, and I do think it's a useful. I know they have a difficult challenge, right? There are a lot of people who like high ungulate numbers, and but realizing, making sure that this information about the impacts of those high numbers is at their fingertips as well, I think is useful. And maybe people like me should spend more time getting in on the lottery and out in the woods harvesting some elk meat, doing our part for forestry that way.
Yeah, I think you bring up an important point that so I think increasingly we have a handle on the science and what we need to do and what will help Aspen to succeed in so many of the problems we face end up being social problems. So it's like,
Right.
how do we balance um the game commissions and a general desire to see these big elk on the landscape and have huntable populations? How do we balance that with sustaining Aspen? And yeah, these are important social questions that I think we need to spend more time talking about.
Yeah, well, and I think you made a good case for the importance of fire on the landscape, and I think we all acknowledge that that's a social challenge. Obviously, there's a bunch of management and science pieces to it as well, but we're all negatively affected by smoke, and there's risk, et cetera, that we have to worry about as sort of a social construct. So, if we're bringing back more, if we're introducing more fire, that may help our aspen, but we're going to have to get there via social moves. Let's see, some discussion on beavers. Um, uh, oh, and there's a question about extent of wolf packs in eastern Arizona. So where the plots with your best recruitment could overlap with some of the extent of wolf packs in eastern Arizona White Mountains. Does that line up with what you sort of know, Connor?
It seems like I know there was a paper, and I cannot think of who the authors were. There was a paper that has sort of tried to directly link wolves with Aspen, regen and recruitment in eastern Arizona. And generally and this was probably 10 or more years ago, they generally concluded that there wasn't real evidence that the wolves were having an impact, just because their population sizes were still so small. I think where we were seeing lots of success for recruitment in eastern Arizona was pretty much due to the wallow fire. So kind of a confounding factor there. But yeah, I think the more, I mean, and maybe we don't need to worry so much about reducing those ungulate population sizes as much as trying to increase movement, whether that's through things like reintroducing wolves, trying to have more hunting tags, and just getting more people out there pushing these elk around to different portions of the landscape. That could be sort of a compromise.
Yeah, again, certainly wolves are a social question as well. Well, at that, we're at the hour. Connor, I really want to thank you. It was great discussion. I certainly learned a lot and fun to just sort of elevate the topic of Aspen. Great participation. Thanks everybody for getting online. We'll share a follow-up email with the recording, and I urge folks to get in touch, stay in touch, whether through the consortium or through the Forest Stewards Guild. Uh, so thanks everybody. And with that, we'll close out the webinar.